Launcher games are an addictive little offshoot of incremental games. Whether you're firing a penguin into an iceberg, or propelling a turtle through a minefield, the core loop is always the same. Launch, earn, upgrade, repeat, pushing the distance you travel a little further with every attempt. Hi, I'm Ross, and this is a devlog for Over the Moon, a tiny launcher game about sending a cow to the moon that I made in the Pico 8 game engine. My first brush with launcher games was Learn to Fly. It was one of the first Flash games I recall playing, and the premise was downright charming. A penguin stumbles across a Kiwipedia article claiming the penguins are flightless birds. Visibly disgruntled by this, they set out to prove the article wrong. The gameplay follows that same core loop of launch, earn, upgrade, repeat, with the penguin equipping better hang gliders and bigger rockets until they eventually fly headfirst into an iceberg. I tried out a few other launcher games later, such as Toss the Turtle and Shopping Cart Hero, but for me personally, none of them quite captured that same spark that the Learn to Fly series did. So, with my limited exposure to the genre, I set out to explore what makes these types of games fun, and whether I could capture the same feeling in my own tiny Pico 8 project. With every launcher game built on the same core loop, the theme becomes essential. It's what gives the repetitive gameplay its own unique character. Learn to Fly 3 escalated the formula that the series had built up in its previous entries by strapping rockets to a penguin in a bid to reach the moon. As a longtime fan of Kerbal Space Program, I loved that escalation, although while I liked the idea of a lunar launch, the penguin always felt like an odd fit for that story. A cow, on the other hand, comes preloaded with a perfect backstory, destined to jump over the moon in the nursery rhyme Hey Diddle Diddle. This made for a pretty fitting premise, where, tired of being reduced to a nursery rhyme punchline, one cow becomes determined to actually make the jump. With this in mind, I hopped into Pico 8 to begin prototyping. If you're not familiar with Pico 8, it's a fantasy console that's used for both making and playing tiny games. Think of it like a virtual retro gaming system with strict limits, those being 128 by 128 pixels of screen space, 16 colours, and tiny cartridge sizes. And just like the old 16-bit machines that Pico 8 imitates, variables in Pico 8 max out at a value of 32,767. For a lot of games, you've never even noticed this quirk, but in a launcher game where you're aiming to reach altitudes in the tens of thousands and blasting across the screen, moving multiple pixels per frame, that cap quickly becomes a problem that you have to design around. So how do you launch something beyond 32,767 meters without the whole game breaking? The trick is, you don't. There's a couple of design features we can implement to circumvent this limitation. Firstly, instead of tracking our altitude using a single number, we can instead split the altitude we're tracking into smaller chunks. One variable handles the current distance travelled, counting up to 9,999 meters before looping back to zero, while a second variable keeps track of how many times we've looped. By combining these variables together, they let us climb far beyond Pico 8's built-in limit. We run into a similar problem when tracking the cow's position in the world. Moving several pixels per frame at 60 frames per second, it doesn't take long before we move 32,767 pixels away from the launchpad. One solution that circumvents this issue is to break the game map into 5 segments. Then as the cow enters the 4th segment, we shift the cow along with all the existing map segments down by 1 chunk. A new segment is loaded into the now empty 5th position while the bottom segment is removed. When the cow starts its descent, we just reverse the process until we've landed back on solid ground. With our main technical hurdle solved, I started to build out the basic gameplay loop. Firstly, we have the launch itself. I set an initial launch speed that kicks the cow off of the ground, with gravity constantly pulling them back down. At first, you barely get off the launch pad, being a short hop off of an old trampoline. However, this will change later down the line once we start upgrading with bigger launchers and rockets. Then, to calculate how much the player earns each run, I settled on using the following formula: 5 times the speed, plus peak altitude divided by 100. Early on, this heavily rewards your initial launch speed, giving you a nice boost of cash even when you barely leave the ground. But as you start investing in rockets and fuel, altitude begins to dominate the equation. That way, the focus naturally shifts away from speed and instead to height as your upgrades start to kick in. And of course, no launcher game is complete without upgrades. I broke these down into 4 separate categories: the launcher, single stage boosters, the main engine, and fuel capacity. As the player starts off with the trampoline already unlocked, this leaves a total of 19 upgrades for the player to buy. Designing these upgrades and writing their little descriptions ended up being my favourite part of the whole project. Each one was a chance to lean into the barnyard theme and give the game a little extra personality. So, with the core gameplay loop in place, it was time to start playtesting. Watching someone else play your game can be incredibly valuable. It can help you to quickly deduce what actually works and what really doesn't. For Over the Moon, the problem showed up almost immediately. The late game was frustrating. This issue was a result of the late game grind. Incremental games thrive on that steady dopamine hit of watching the numbers go up. But if you know it'll take 3 or 4 runs before you can afford the next upgrade, those interim runs quickly start to feel pointless, especially since there wasn't much in the way of run-to-run gameplay to keep things interesting. Now, one obvious solution would have just been to add gameplay, and make each launch more interactive than just holding the boost button, with meaningful choices that affect each run's outcome. It sounds great on paper, but with how fast we're moving during the late game runs, I struggled to find a realistic way to add meaningful decisions mid-flight without slowing down the game or making it feel awkward. So instead, I opted to tackle the problem at its source and cut the late game grind. I rebalanced the game's economy so that, even in the late game, you'd never need more than 2 runs to afford a new upgrade. I also tweaked the costs to give players more freedom in what they wanted to unlock and when, instead of being locked into a linear upgrade path. With these changes, the game's total runtime was cut in half, from around 20 minutes down to 10. Now, upgrades keep rolling in at a steady pace, the dopamine hits keep coming consistently, and the game wraps itself up before it overstays its welcome. So, with the game's economy rebalanced, it was time to bring everything together and add the finishing touches. Those being a title screen, background music and sound effects to give each run a bit more personality, an intro cutscene that sets the tone and establishes why we're determined to launch for the moon, and lastly, an endgame cutscene that plays when the player finishes the game. Individually, each of these additions didn't take all too long to implement, but they really helped to transform the project from feeling like a prototype into something that felt more like a complete game. So that's Over the Moon, a small barnyard-themed launcher game about blasting a determined cow to the moon, one upgrade at a time. I had a blast making it, and it was nostalgic to revisit the classic launcher games in an attempt to discover what makes these types of games fun. If you'd like to give it a try, it's free to play on itch.io. I'll put a link to it in the description. And if you made it this far, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for future updates. Thanks for watching.